The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the garden of Holloway Palace, once the jewel of the British Raj in northern India. Florence Neville watched as her 5-year-old charge, young Lord Edward, chased butterflies between the manicured hedges. The boy's laughter carried on the warm breeze, bringing an involuntary smile to her lips despite the heaviness in her heart. "Edward, mind your shoes. The Maharaja's delegation arrives tomorrow, and your father wishes you presentable," she called, her English accent crisper than usual whenever she mentioned the Duke. The boy turned, his dark curls falling across his forehead in a way that made her heart constrict. "Yes, mother," he called back cheerfully before resuming his pursuit. Florence froze, her breath catching. In 5 years, she had never allowed him to call her that in the open air where servants or, heaven forbid, the Duke himself might hear. Inside their private chambers, behind locked doors during bedtime stories, yes. But never where others might witness this forbidden truth. "Edward," she whispered, hurrying to him and kneeling despite the damage to her plain governess skirts. "You must remember, I am Miss Neville. Always Miss Neville when we are not alone." The boy's face fell, his eyes, so like his father's, clouding with confusion. "But why? Father isn't even here. He's always with the soldiers." "Because your father, the great Duke of Holloway, William Zander, does not know you are his son," she thought but could never say. Instead, she straightened his collar. "It is simply the proper way. Now, shall we practice your Hindi before supper? The Maharaja will be most impressed by a young English lord who speaks his language." As they walked hand in hand toward the east wing, Florence caught sight of a familiar figure watching from a second-story window, Mrs. Peregrine, the housekeeper, whose knowing eyes had followed Florence for years. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line before she disappeared behind the curtain. Another person who suspected the truth. Another threat to the careful life Florence had constructed from the ashes of her ruined reputation. The evening brought a telegram announcing the Duke's early return from the northern campaign. The household erupted into frantic preparation, with Florence ensuring Edward's nursery was immaculate while trying to calm her racing heart. 5 months had passed since the Duke's last visit to his Indian estate. 5 blessed months of peace with her son. "Will father want to see me?" Edward asked as Florence buttoned his nightshirt. "I'm certain he will," she lied. The Duke rarely spared more than 10 minutes for the boy he believed to be his ward, the orphan son of a distant cousin, left in his care after a tragic accident. The story had been carefully constructed by the Duke's mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, who had discovered Florence's condition 6 years ago. The scandal would destroy him, the Dowager had said, her voice like ice as Florence wept in her chambers at the family's English estate. "My son's indiscretion with a lady's companion cannot be made public. You will bear the child in secret, and then decisions will be made." Those decisions had resulted in Florence being shipped to India as governess to her own son, with none but the Dowager knowing the truth. The old woman had died 2 winters past, leaving Florence to guard her secret alone. Sleep eluded her that night. By dawn, Florence had composed herself, donning her most severe governess attire, high-necked, grey, and deliberately unflattering. She pinned her auburn hair into a tight bun that pulled at her temples, embracing the headache as penance for the flutter in her stomach at the thought of seeing William again. The Duke's arrival brought the expected commotion, servants scurrying, officers saluting, local officials bowing. Florence kept Edward out of the way, watching from the nursery window as William dismounted in the courtyard below. At 35, he remained striking, tall and broad-shouldered in his uniform, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. The boy beside her pressed his small hands against the glass. "He looks tired," Edward observed with surprising perception. Florence swallowed. "Leading men is tiring work. When I'm grown, will I lead men too?" The question pierced her. Edward would inherit nothing from his father, not the title, not the estates, not even his name. Perhaps. "Now, let us review your lessons before you are called to greet his grace." That evening, the Duke requested Edward's presence at dinner, an unprecedented honor. Florence helped the boy dress in his finest clothes, her fingers trembling as she tied his cravat. "Will you come with me?" Edward asked, his small face solemn. "No, darling. This is for you alone." She kissed his forehead, inhaling his sweet scent. "Remember your manners and speak only when spoken to." After sending him downstairs with a maid, Florence paced her small chamber, unable to concentrate on her book or needlework. 2 hours later, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find the Duke himself standing in the corridor, still in his evening clothes. "Your Grace," she gasped, dropping into an automatic curtsy. "Miss Neville." His voice was deeper than she remembered. "May I have a word?" She stepped aside, heart hammering against her ribs as he entered her modest quarters. This was improper, dangerously so, but who would dare question the Duke's movements in his own home? William stood with his back to her, examining the simple furnishings. "The boy has improved since my last visit. He studies diligently, Your Grace. He mentioned you read him Homer in the original Greek." William turned, his grey eyes, Edward's eyes, searching her face. "I was unaware ladies' companions received such thorough education." Florence stiffened. "I was intended for more than companionship before circumstances altered my path. Your mother knew this when she hired me." Something flickered across his features, recognition, perhaps, of the abbreviated truth. 6 years ago, Florence had been engaged to a promising young diplomat until William, home on leave and drinking too freely at a summer ball, had charmed her into the gardens. Their brief, passionate encounter had shattered her engagement and her future when her condition became known. "Edward speaks of you constantly," William said, moving closer. "It seems you've become quite important to him. Children naturally form attachments to those who care for them. Is that all it is? Mere professional duty?" His eyes narrowed. "He watches you with such devotion." Fear clawed at her throat. "I've been his primary caretaker since infancy, Your Grace. Such bonds are not unusual." William studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. "You seem familiar to me, Miss Neville. Have we met before my mother sent you to India?" "I believe I served tea at one of the Dowager's gatherings," she replied carefully. Nothing more. The lie hung between them. Florence held her breath, wondering if he might finally recognize her, the shy companion who had bloomed under his attention for one magical evening before being discarded. Instead, he nodded curtly. "Continue your excellent work with the boy. I decided to remain at Holloway for the season. The political situation has stabilized enough to permit my presence here." "The entire season, Your Grace." Florence couldn't mask her alarm. "Does that displease you, Miss Neville?" "Of course not. I shall adjust Edward's lessons accordingly." "See that you do." He moved toward the door, then paused. "He called you the mother tonight. At dinner. Did you know that?" Florence's world tilted. Children sometimes confuse," I corrected him, naturally. "But I wonder why a child in your care for 5 years would make such an error." His expression hardened. "Unless he's been encouraged to do so." "I would never." The denial burst forth with genuine horror. Perhaps he meant it as a term of endearment. "I shall speak with him immediately." William watched her for a long moment. "See that you do. Good night, Miss Neville." After he left, Florence sank to her knees, trembling. Everything she had sacrificed, her reputation, her homeland, her very identity, could crumble if Edward continued to forget himself. Yet how could she scold her son for speaking the truth she had whispered to him in private moments since he could first understand? The following weeks brought unprecedented changes to Holloway Palace. The Duke, rather than spending his days with military matters, began taking interest in Edward's education. He requested reports of the boys' progress, observed lessons, and even accompanied them on nature walks through the palace grounds. Florence found herself constantly in William's presence, maintaining a careful distance while watching father and son grow closer. Each shared smile between them brought both joy and terror, joy to see Edward blossom under his father's attention, terror that their secret might be discovered. He has a remarkable mind, William commented one afternoon as they watched Edward sketch a peacock strutting across the lawn. Sharp and curious. Reminds me of someone. Florence busied herself with her needlework. Children often reflect those around them. Your influence has been most positive. My influence? I've been absent most of his life. His voice carried a note of regret that surprised her. It's your influence that shaped him, Miss Neville. She dared a glance at his face and found him watching her instead of Edward. Every child requires a feminine touch, Your Grace. I merely provided what he lacked. And what of your own needs, Miss Neville? Surely spending your youth isolated on a foreign estate caring for another's child was not your ambition. The question caught her off guard. We don't always receive what we wish for in life. No, he agreed quietly. We often don't. Later that evening, a letter arrived from England. Florence recognized the seal of the Duke's solicitor and felt a familiar dread. William read it in his study while she supervised Edward's bedtime nearby. When the boy was finally asleep, she found herself drawn to the garden, seeking solace under the star-filled Indian sky. She didn't hear William approach until his voice broke the silence. Miss Neville, or should I say, Miss Florence Northwood. Florence froze, her maiden name striking her like a physical blow. She turned slowly to find him standing in the shadows, letter in hand. My mother's solicitor has died, he said, his voice dangerously calm. His replacement found certain documents among his effects. Documents concerning your employment and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. Your Grace, I can explain, can you? Can you explain why my mother's companion disappeared suddenly from England 6 years ago, only to reappear in India as a governess to a child who arrived mysteriously at my estate? He stepped closer, moonlight revealing the fury in his eyes. Can you explain why this child, supposedly my distant cousin's orphan, bears a striking resemblance to me? Florence's legs threatened to give way. Please, not here. Where then? Your chambers, where you've been hiding my son all these years. Or perhaps the nursery, where he calls you a mother when he thinks no one can hear. You knew, she whispered. I suspected. The solicitor's letters confirmed it. William's face contorted with emotion. How could you keep this from me? My own child. Your mother gave me no choice. The words burst forth, years of silent anguish breaking free. She discovered my condition after you'd already returned to India. She said the scandal would destroy your career, that you were betrothed to Lady Caroline Pennington. She offered me this position as Edward's governess or threatened to send me to an asylum and the child to an orphanage. William staggered back as if struck. Caroline? There was never any betrothal. My mother tried to arrange it for years, but I refused. Florence felt the ground shift beneath her. She told me the marriage was settled. That any claim I made would only bring shame upon you and the child. And you believed her without question? Without writing to me? What would I have said? Florence's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. That your mother's companion had borne your illegitimate son. That one night in the gardens had destroyed my engagement and my future. Your mother intercepted all correspondence. I had no one to turn to, nowhere to go. William's anger seemed to drain away, replaced by something more complex. So you came here. Became his governess. Raised my son while I lived under the same roof, oblivious. I did what I thought best for Edward. Tears flowed freely now. He has been loved every day of his life. Can you say that was wrong? No, William whispered. But the deception was never my choice. Florence straightened her shoulders. Now that you know the truth, what will you do? Send us away? Separate me from my child? The question hung between them, weighted with 6 years of secrets. William's face was unreadable in the moonlight as a servant approached, calling his name. Your Grace! Urgent dispatch from the Viceroy. William turned to Florence, his expression conflicted. This isn't finished. Stay in your quarters until I send for you. She watched him stride away, her future once again in his hands. The following day passed in agonizing uncertainty. Florence was relieved of her duties, confined to her room like a prisoner. She packed her meager belongings, certain that exile awaited her. Edward, she learned from a sympathetic maid, had been told she was unwell and kept occupied with a new tutor. Near sunset, William finally summoned her to his study. She entered with her head high despite her terror, finding him standing by the window, silhouetted against the fading light. "Sit, please," he said without turning. She perched on the edge of a chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've been reviewing my mother's correspondence," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "It seems she orchestrated this entire situation, your disgrace, Edward's false identity, even my prolonged deployments that kept me from spending time at Holloway. Why would she do such a thing?" William finally faced her. "My father left the estate in considerable debt. My mother needed an advantageous marriage to restore our family's fortune. My indiscretion with you threatened her plans." "Lady Caroline's dowry," Florence murmured. "Precisely." He moved to his desk, picking up a stack of letters. "She wrote to Caroline's father even as she was arranging your departure, promising my hand and claiming any rumors of my impropriety were malicious lies. Did you marry her?" "No. I refused all her candidates, much to her fury." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I had my reasons, though I couldn't have named them at the time." Florence felt a flicker of something dangerous, hope. "And now? What happens now?" William set the letters down carefully. "That depends. The solicitor's documents include your original contract with my mother. It contains a provision I find particularly interesting." He lifted a paper. "Upon the event of the Dowager's death, the boy's true parentage shall be revealed to the Duke, and compensation of £5,000 shall be paid to Miss Northwood for her silence and immediate departure from all family properties." Florence gasped. "I never agreed to that." "I signed papers, yes, but they were explained as necessary for my employment. I never saw any provision about leaving Edward." "I believe you." William's voice softened. "My mother's manipulations extended to us both." He set the contract down. "Which leaves us with a decision to make." "I won't leave him," Florence said fiercely. "I would rather live as a pauper with my son than wealthy without him." "Our son," William corrected gently. The word hung between them, fragile and powerful. "Florence," he continued, using her given name for the first time since that night in the English garden, "I have spent the night considering our situation. The political tensions here have made certain things clear to me. Life is uncertain, and I've wasted too much of it." He moved around the desk, kneeling before her chair in a gesture so unexpected she could only stare at him in shock. "I should have recognized you the moment I saw you again. Perhaps some part of me did, which is why I've never been able to marry despite my mother's schemes." He took her hands in his. "I cannot undo these years of separation, but I can offer you, both of you, a future." "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that Edward deserves his mother and his father. I'm saying that I've watched you these past weeks and seen your grace, your intelligence, your devotion to our son. I'm saying," he drew a deep breath, "that I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." Florence felt the room spin. "This is madness. The scandal can be managed. We'll return to England, announce our engagement, and explain that Edward is my ward who will now be legally adopted as my heir. Only we need know the full truth until he's old enough to understand." "You would marry your son's governess? A woman with no family, no dowry, no connections." William's grip tightened on her hands. "I would marry the mother of my child. The woman who sacrificed everything to protect him. The woman I should have searched for 6 years ago instead of believing my mother's lies." Florence searched his face for any sign of obligation or pity, finding instead an earnestness that stole her breath. "And if I refuse? Will you take Edward from me?" Pain flashed across his features. "I would never separate you." If marriage is not what you want, I'll establish you both nearby. You'll want for nothing, and Edward will remain in your care." "And what do you want, William?" she dared to ask, using his given name for the first time since that fateful night. "A chance," he said simply. "A chance to know my son. A chance to know you, and not as the girl from my memories or the governess from these past weeks, but as the woman you've become. A chance to be the father and husband I should have been all along." Before she could respond, the study door burst open and Edward ran in, followed by a flustered maid. "Father! Is it true Miss Neville is ill? Will she go away like my other mother did?" William and Florence exchanged startled glances. Florence recovered first, opening her arms to the boy who flung himself into her embrace. "No, darling," she soothed, stroking his hair. "I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" Edward demanded, his small face fierce with worry. Florence looked over his head at William, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I promise," she said. "In fact, I have wonderful news. His Grace, your father, has asked me a very important question." Edward turned to William expectantly. "I've asked Miss Neville to become my wife," William explained, his voice gentle. "Which would make her your mother. Officially." Edward's expression transformed from confusion to radiant joy. "So I can call you mother all the time? Even when people can hear?" Florence felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "Yes, my darling. If that's what you wish. And we'll all live together? Forever." William moved closer, placing one hand on his son's shoulder and the other on Florence's. "That's my dearest hope." Florence looked up at him, seeing not the Duke or the distant guardian, but the man, flawed and seeking redemption, offering her not just security but partnership. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity. "Yes," she said, answering both Edward's question and William's proposal in a single breath. "Forever." William's smile broke like dawn across his face. He lifted Edward onto his lap as he sat beside Florence, the three of them finally together as the family they were always meant to be. Outside the windows of Holloway Palace, the Indian sunset painted the sky in brilliant golds and reds, the closing of one chapter and the illumination of the next. Florence Neville, who had lived so long in shadows, stepped finally into the light, her son's hand in hers and his father's love surrounding them both.